In the autumn of 1894, a Dominican priest named Father Anselm Voss descended into a shaft beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that his own order had been quietly excavating for 11 years. He carried a wax candle, a leather journal, and a letter of authorization bearing a seal that no bishop alive today has been able to identify. By the time Father Voss was pulled back to the surface 6 hours later, 3 of his fingernails had been worn to nothing, his candle was unlit but still warm, and every page of his journal had been filled, not in his handwriting. He never entered a confessional again. He never gave a sermon again. When the Dominican Prior asked him what he had seen below the final door, Voss said only that the room had been expecting someone and that he did not believe it had been expecting him. This is the story of what Father Anselm Voss found past the last stone. Voss was born in 1851 in Freiburg, Germany, to a family of archivists. His father catalogued manuscripts for the University of Freiburg. His grandfather had worked briefly for the Vatican's secret archives, before being dismissed under circumstances the family never discussed. By the time Anselm entered the Dominican order at 22, he could read Church Latin, Koine Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and 2 dialects of Aramaic. He was not a mystic. He was a documentarian in a priest's collar, and that distinction matters enormously for what follows. What brought him to Jerusalem was not faith. It was a letter. In 1883, a British military engineer named Captain Charles Warren, the same Warren who had conducted the famous shaft excavations beneath the Temple Mount a decade earlier, sent a sealed communication to the Dominican Priory in Jerusalem. The letter has never been officially acknowledged by the order. A secondary reference to it survives in a ledger entry from the Priory's supply records, dated March of 1883, which lists an unusual requisition: 40 feet of rope, 8 iron pitons, and, listed at the bottom in a different hand, 1 interpreter of ancient scripts. That interpreter was eventually identified as Father Anselm Voss, who arrived in Jerusalem 4 months later and did not leave for 11 years. Warren himself was never publicly associated with what followed. By 1883, he had already given the world his maps of the underground cisterns, tunnels, and foundation stones beneath the mount. What he had not given the world, what he had apparently given only to a Dominican prior and a German archivist priest, was the location of something his published reports described only as an anomalous void of undetermined origin at a depth inconsistent with any known period of construction. Voss spent those 11 years mapping. He learned the tunnel systems the way a man learns the hallways of his own house. He cataloged every carving, every inscription, every blocked passage. He cross-referenced what he found against sources the British Survey had never consulted. A 12th century Arabic manuscript held by a private family in Damascus, a set of Crusader-era engineering notes discovered inside a wall in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1879, and a document he referred to in his own letters only as the Solomonic Index, whose origin he never specified. Before we go further, if you find these buried histories as necessary as I do, subscribe now. The next investigation drops soon, and these stories don't surface twice. The descent happened on October 3, 1894. Voss went alone. The passage he entered had been located by cross-referencing Warren's void measurements with a specific set of coordinates embedded in the Damascus manuscript. Coordinates that, when plotted against the foundation stones of the mount, pointed to a sealed shaft behind what is today a maintenance wall in the southeastern corner of the underground cistern system known as the Great Sea. The first 60 feet were cut limestone. Standard Herodian-era construction, the kind of stonework that dates to the renovation of the Second Temple. At 70 feet, the limestone ended. The walls became something older, not in appearance, but in character. Voss described the stone as having been placed rather than quarried. The blocks were fitted with tolerances he had never seen in any structure he had documented. No mortar, no tool marks. A join so precise his fingernail could not find the seam. At 90 feet, the air changed. He described it as the sensation of entering a library, his exact phrase, a pressure of accumulated stillness, as if the air had not moved in a very long time and had learned to prefer it. At 110 feet, the passage ended in a landing. The landing opened into a corridor. The corridor was not cut by hand. The walls were curved, consistent, and lined at intervals of roughly 8 feet by stone pillars carved with a repeating motif. He described the motif as a tree whose roots and branches were the same shape, meeting at a central point that was simultaneously the top and the bottom. Between the pillars were panels. The panels were not blank. They were inscribed in a script Voss, who could read 5 ancient languages, did not recognize, not fully. He recognized fragments. He wrote in a letter to his prior, one of only 3 letters from this period that survive, that the script appeared to share root structures with Proto-Sinaitic, the oldest known ancestor of the alphabet, but had been developed in a direction that the historical record does not account for. A direction, he wrote, that suggested whoever had developed it had continued doing so long after the civilization that supposedly used Proto-Sinaitic had already collapsed. That detail has never been adequately addressed by anyone, not in 1894, not now. The corridor ended at a door. The door was a single slab of dark stone, polished smooth, set into the rock with the same impossible tolerances as the walls above it. It had no handle, no visible mechanism. In its center was a carved relief, not decorative, but functional in some way Voss could not immediately explain. The relief showed 2 figures facing each other across what appeared to be a table or altar. Above the altar, suspended between the 2 figures, was an object. The object was rectangular. It had 2 winged shapes rising from its lid. Voss was a man who had read the original Hebrew descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant in 3 different manuscript traditions. He wrote in his journal that he did not allow himself to believe what he was looking at for several minutes. Then he allowed himself to believe it. The door was not locked. It was, as best he could describe it, balanced. When he placed both palms flat against the stone and applied steady pressure, it moved. The room on the other side was not large, roughly 20 feet square. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man would have had to bow his head. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in inscription, the same unknown script, but here arranged in columns, with illustrations between them showing astronomical configurations, architectural cross-sections of structures that do not match any known building tradition, and what appeared to be a sequential record of something. A history, possibly, a catalog. He could not read it. What he could read was a single line carved above the entrance arch on the interior side of the door. It was in Biblical Hebrew. It was Old Hebrew, older, he believed, than the standardized scriptural text his order used. His translation of it, written in the margin of a letter and later transcribed by his prior, read, "What was placed here was not placed here by those who built here. What was placed here is still placed here. Do not ask by whom." In the center of the room was a stone table. The table was empty. Whatever had rested on it had left a rectangular impression in the surface, approximately 4 feet long, approximately 2.5 feet wide. The impression was worn, not by handling, by time. Whatever had sat in that impression had sat there long enough that the stone beneath it had been gradually, imperceptibly compressed. He spent 2 hours in that room. He copied what he could. He drew what he could not copy. And when his candle guttered and went out, he realized the room had not gone dark. There was a low illumination coming from the inscribed walls themselves, not bright, not warm, not like fire, more like the phosphorescence of deep water. Even sourceless, patient. He did not find the Ark. What he found was the room the Ark had been taken from, and the record of what had put it there to begin with. A record written in a language older than Solomon, older than David, older than any civilization mainstream archaeology credits with the capacity to have written it. This is where the pattern emerges, because Voss was not the first person to find this room. He was simply the first person in the modern era to survive it and write about it. In the 12th century, a Crusader chronicler named Theoderic mentioned in passing, in a text that has never been fully translated into English, that certain knights of a particular brotherhood had descended into the undercroft of the mount and had returned in a state of, and here I am using the closest available translation, reversed knowing, meaning they understood less after what they had seen than they had before it. In the 9th century, an Abbasid-era account of a Jerusalem scholar describes a locked subterranean chamber whose guardian inscription warned that the room contained not a holy object, but the record of the holy object's true origin, which was not where the tradition claimed. In 1 Kings, there is a line that every seminary student is taught to interpret metaphorically. It describes Solomon, upon the completion of the temple, going alone into a room beneath the foundation and remaining there for 3 days. When he emerged, the text says he wept, not from joy. The Hebrew word used is the same word used elsewhere in Scripture to describe the weeping of a man who has learned something he cannot unknow. These 3 accounts, from the 9th century, the 12th century, and the biblical text itself, all describe the same room in consistent terms. A room below the foundation. A room with writing. A room that changes the person who enters it. A room that is not about the ark. A room that is about what the ark was brought to protect, or contain, or commemorate. Father Anselm Voss returned to the surface at dusk on October 3, 1894. His prior saw his face and immediately dismissed the 2 other brothers who were present. Voss said nothing that evening. The next morning, he presented his journal, filled in that unknown hand, to the prior and asked him to keep it somewhere that was not the priory library. He asked this specifically with emphasis. He did not want it archived. He wanted it hidden. Then he sat down and wrote 3 letters. One to his family in Freiburg, which has survived and contains nothing about the descent. One to an academic contact in Vienna, which has not survived. And one to Captain Charles Warren in London, which survived because Warren apparently never opened it. It was found sealed among his personal effects when he died in 1927. The family donated his papers to a British military archive. The letter from Voss appears in the archive's intake manifest from 1929. It does not appear in any inventory after 1931. 2 years after the descent, Voss returned to Germany. He took a position as a librarian at a monastery in Bavaria. He did not preach, he did not publish. He corresponded with no one in Jerusalem. He lived quietly for 34 more years, and when he died in 1928, the only item found in his personal cell besides his breviary and his habit was a single sheet of paper on which he had drawn, carefully and in ink that had faded almost to nothing, the relief carving from the face of the door, the 2 figures, the altar, the winged object suspended between them. Below the drawing, in his own handwriting, was a single line in Latin. It translates, "It was not built for them. It was not built for us. I do not know for whom it was built, but I believe it is still waiting." In 1967, Israeli archaeologists and military personnel gained access to the tunnels and subterranean spaces beneath the Temple Mount for the first time following the 6-Day War. The excavations that followed were the most significant archaeological undertaking in the history of the region. The results that were published are well documented. The results that were not published have been the subject of sustained controversy for nearly 6 decades. A 1999 investigation by an Israeli documentary team, subsequently shelved before broadcast, included testimony from a retired archaeologist who claimed that during the 1967-era surveys, a sealed subchamber was located at a depth inconsistent with any known period of construction, and that a decision was made at a level above the archaeological team not to open it, not to document it in the public record, and not to discuss it. That archaeologist's name was redacted from the documentary's working transcript, a copy of which was obtained by a researcher in 2004 and posted to an academic forum before the thread was removed. The researcher, a doctoral candidate at Hebrew University named Miriam Oded, submitted a paper in 2006 referencing the documentary and the sealed chamber. The paper was rejected by 4 journals. She left academic publishing in 2008. She gave one interview in 2011 to a small independent outlet in which she said only that what she had found was not a mystery. It was a decision. Someone had decided this would not be known, and unlike a mystery, a decision has authors. The chamber Voss entered in 1894 was 110 feet below the surface of the Temple Mount. The anomalous void Warren identified in his unpublished notes was described as being located at approximately that depth. The sealed subchamber reportedly located during the 1967 surveys was described, in the redacted transcript, as being at a depth of between 90 and 120 feet. These are three separate accounts from three separate time periods, pointing to the same place. Nobody with institutional authority has ever explained this convergence. Not because it cannot be explained, because explaining it would require acknowledging that beneath one of the most contested and surveyed patches of ground on Earth, there is a room with writing in a language older than any known civilization in the region, and that the room was built for a purpose nobody in a position of authority is willing to state publicly. Father Anselm Voss was not a credulous man. He was a man trained from childhood to evaluate primary sources, authenticate documents, and resist the pull of interpretation that outran evidence. He descended into that shaft with skepticism as his lantern and came back with the lantern out and something else in its place. He spent the next 34 years in a monastery in Bavaria, saying nothing, drawing that door from memory, writing a single line at the bottom. It is still waiting. The question that does not have a comfortable answer is, waiting for what? If something in this investigation unsettled you the way it should, pass it to one person, not to convince them, just to make sure you are not the only one who knows. The official history of Solomon's Temple is a chapter that begins in the middle. What came before the first verse is still carved on the walls of a room under the mount, in a language nobody is authorized to read. I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, look beneath the foundation.